Hi, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. Tuesday, I'm really happy to be here today on this wonderful occasion. So well done, Galiano Conservancy, for yet another AGM. It's always inspiring to just witness all the people power that keeps the engine of the natural world and all of the good things that make society worth living alive. So pollinators and people. Before anything, actually, can anyone guess where this picture was taken from? You probably can identify it's a camas. Just shout it out. Do you know where it is?
Yeah, it's right opposite North Shore.
That's right. Yeah, that's the North Shore of Vancouver, and this is actually the Vancouver Convention Center green room.
Oh, it's a green room.
It's a green room. Yeah. So that's the only green room part of my talk, but I just had to put it in.
Wow.
Yeah. Largest non-industrial green roof in North America, in Vancouver. Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. So I just want to acknowledge the ground that we're standing on right now, which is, Coast Salish territory, lots of unceded land, some ceded land, and just really wanting to acknowledge the stewardship of the Hunkaminam speaking people that have been on this land and waters since time immemorial. And I really like to evoke the indigenous spirit of this land, because we're talking about native bees, which means we're talking about native pollinators, native plants, which means we're talking about the land. So I really invite us all to really kind of bring that to mind when we are walking around the land, that we are actually, our footsteps are, every opportunity is, it's an opportunity for decolonization. Okay, so I already got the intro. Thank you. That's actually one of my green roof research site for my PhD. The steep one. But just wanted to let you know that this presentation is put together by a number of wonderful minds from my board members on the Native Bee Society. I will confess straight away, full disclosure, I am actually a plant person. I got into native bees because I knew that they were really important, and that when I'm working with plants, that I'm actually directly having an influence on the lives and the populations of native bees. So personally, having worked in restoration ecology and now urban ecology, just by choosing plants, I consider bees my primary client. So I'm always advocating for them. And I really hope to evoke that sort of spirit in your hearts too. So yeah, there's three major sections to the talk. Just a quick backgrounder, which includes some audience engagement. And then the key principles on what we can each do to support native bees. So we'll look at forage, nesting, and maintenance. And then just closing off with how we can better support our native bees. And I think we said we'll do questions at the end. So if you've got a good question, maybe just hold on to it. Same goes for the Zoom folks. Well, Zoom folks, you can put your question in the chat and then we'll address them at the end. So it's a quick background, the Native Bee Society, we're a very young society. We had our first AGM in 2019, and of course, right in time for the pandemic. So we're just kind of coming into our own. In fact, on Thursday, I'm going to be traveling up to Penticton for bee school, which is actually the 9th BC course. We'll be doing really fun stuff in the lab and in the fields. Yeah, so we are a collective of artists, scientists, honey beekeepers, pollination ecologists, yeah, all with one mission, which is basically to advocate for native bees, to give them a voice, and to promote their conservation in this great province. So some of the things we do are, you can kind of see here, we do guided walks. That's the first bee I ever caught. Carefully, of course, in the net. But yeah, so we do online in person. We have a monthly bee study group, which is really fun. You basically, if you have pictures, you throw them on the slide deck and everyone talks about them. It's like bee nerd central. The nerdier, the better. And you can also just sit and watch and like absorb. That's what I do because I know very little. We also, I have to tell you about the master melittologist. So you know master gardener? So master melittologist means like master bee person. And it's through Oregon State University. They have an Oregon Bee Atlas. One of our board members runs that program. He's Canadian though, which is why he's one of our board members too. And that's a self-paced program. It's a really great way to get to know bees and very supportive too. And then if anyone here uses iNaturalist, yeah, seeing some nods. So we have a project called Bee Tracker, and that's a really great place you can post your pictures. Of course, there are certain, there's guidelines, like, you know, you need a bunch of different angles for pictures to work, but it's a wonderful resource, and it's a great way to learn native bees as well. And the last thing I'll say is, in addition to workshops and excursions like this, we also do primary research. So we really try to fire on all our cylinders, doing projects, doing education, doing research, citizen science, and so on. And it's really fun. Okay, so we're going to start with the talk now. So we're just going to do a quick poll, and you can, what should we do? Maybe raise your hand. How many bee species are native to BC, do you think? And when I say native, I mean they evolved here along with the other plants that basically since the last ice sheet, so the last 10 or 12,000 years. So 5, who thinks 5 species? One that decided to vote for a different number. Smart. Okay, what about 50? 50 native bees? Okay, it's maybe like 6 votes. What about 200? Oh, okay, that's more like 15. Okay, and what about last call, more than 500? Right. Well, you'll be happy to know there is no judgment here. Oh, right, we actually.
I'll just put that up really quick.
Then folks can raise their hands. Okay, so the
Happy to know why. If you're a little bit deaf, you don't catch some of it like I am.
okay, great to know.
I'll sit at the front.
If you came to the front, that would probably be useful. I will try to project. Oops. I said there's no judgment.
Oh,
That's all. So thank you for letting me know. So I didn't even check. Can you hear me better now?
yes.
Excellent. Okay, so the answer to the question, which I'm sure you're all on the edges of your seats, is there's actually over 600 species of bees that are native to these lands. When this presentation was made 2 years ago, it was 590.
Wow.
Since then, just because of advances in like genetics that we're able to actually do the chromosomal analysis, we know that there's over 600. And of course, why is that? Because this is a very diverse province. It's a very crude map, but you get a sense. So bee species are the colors. So check this out. Southern interior, around 400 species of native bees. So that's obviously a hot spot, right? That's why we're going there for bee school. The coast, even the coast, you know, how many flowers live in the Jurassic forests of like the west coast of Vancouver Island? Very few, right? We've got, it's mostly conifers, but there's still 140 species of bees there. So you kind of get a sense of just how they're distributed. And of course, think about the biogeoclimatic zones of BC, right? This is where the desert is. This is where like that up the higher interior. So we've got a huge diversity ecosystem. So that really explains the diversity. But then it comes down to, okay, so those are wild places. What about where people are? Quite an old study at this point recorded 556 bee species just for the city of Vancouver. And of course, this is bee species in general, not just native. Honeybees are not native, of course, they're European. The eastern bumblebee is not native, that's escaped from the greenhouses and now putting our western bumblebee population at risk. So those 56 species are not just native, but you can see a city supports bees. So let's take it back to the greater engineering, the ecosystem engineers at RRBs. So, you know, the term ecosystem engineer, like worms, ants, ecosystem engineers, beavers are classic. Well, bees can actually be qualified as such too, because without them, our ecosystems will collapse, right? So they're pretty essential to our biosphere, least of all to like the food that we eat, right? We wouldn't have food if we didn't have pollinators. But like most forms of life in this era of global biodiversity decline. There's a lot of challenges that they face as a general taxonomic group. So habitat loss affects all species. Also, pesticides are obviously affecting our insects quite dramatically. Diseases and invasive species, diseases that might be associated with, for example, big honey cow farms, like massive honeybee operations where the bees aren't cared for, they produce pathogens, viruses that gets out, affects our native populations, and we have no idea because we know very little about our native bees. But that is a problem that we do know about. And then, of course, climate change, which is such a huge threat to all life, actually. But let's stay focused on bees. So just a quick overview of the native bees of BC. So first of all, they come in all colors of the rainbow. We used to say bees are being yellow and black. Well, in BC, we have metallic green sweat bees. We have blue, shiny orchard bees, and like everything in between. Honestly, the rainbow represented. Also, the majority of our native bees are solitary. Does anyone know which one grouping of our native bees are not solitary, that actually live in colonies? Bumblebees, very good. Man front. Yeah, and we'll get into that in a second with the different nesting types, but the key point is that most of our native bees do not have nests. They certainly don't build hives. Actually, this bee here, going into the ground, and that's because all of our native bees, yes, remove the word hive from your lexicon today. They nest in cavities or in the ground. So actually 70% of our native bees nest in the ground nesting bees. And so if you've got bare or partially vegetated soil, also known as crappy lawn, you could actually put a little fence around it with a little sign that says, welcome ground nesting bees. And guess what? If you sat down and watched that patch of earth, you would probably see action. We just rarely actually sit down and stare at crappy lawn, but it's well worth it. And then 30% of our native bees are cavity nesters. So they nest in woody tunnels, like this Seratina is actually digging into that pithy interior of that stem. I'm going to get into species that are really good to plants that are good for cavity nesters. And of course, you're also probably familiar with like the bee boxes, like mason bee boxes have really gained a lot of popularity these days. And that's basically an artificial cavity nest that is provided. Okay, now for a game. So we're gonna do like a rapid fire, just quick visuals, and you get to say whether it's a bee or not a bee. And then we will assess and we'll do it. So it's 2 rounds of a couple each. So bee or not a bee? Bee. Not a bee. Not a bee. I'm just gonna invite you to look at the eyes. Oh, yeah. Okay. It's a fly. It's a bee mimic fly. Okay, next one. Bee or not a bee? Bee. Look at the antennae. See the antennae coming out? It's a fly. It's a fly. Last one. Bee or not a bee? Okay, that was confident. Well done. So for this one, see the antennae? There's actually, there's one there. Eyes not quite as big as the flies. So those were flies and bees. And just very briefly, bees have long, slender antennae. Flies have short antennae and they often come right out of the same place. Big thing is the number of wings. Bees have 4 wings, flies have 2. And then of course, bees collect pollen, right? So they have special hairs or baskets. Flies don't have anything to do with pollen. So they don't actually have those hairs. And then, as I mentioned, the eyes. And remember, like flies have huge eyes, right? Like sometimes they cover the whole head. So that's a really good tip. Okay, second round. bee or not a bee?
Bee.
Yes. Good job. Bee or not a bee? Okay, we know what this is, right? Vespula germanica. Wasp. Yes. Okay, and I think this is the last one. Bee or not a bee?
Bee.
Okay, so that was like looking at bees and wasps. So trickier, honestly, tricky. They both have 4 wings. So wing number is not going to help you. But what do they eat? What do wasps eat? I like to say they eat hamburgers, right? So they're omnivores. Whereas bees are total herbivores. They only take from plants, from flowers. That's right. Yeah. It's not barbecue season yet, but yeah. Then anatomy, so also similar. The slim waist is typical actually of any aculeate Hymenoptera, which includes all bees and some wasps. But then, you know, things like the antennae, where they arise on the part of the face. I'm not even going to go into this because at the end of the day, bees and wasps are tricky. They're very close, but there's different ways you can adjust your seeing. So it's like, oh, is it, if it's eating my hamburger, then it's definitely not a bee. Yeah, and of course stinging, right? Like wasps can sting many times. Bees they only sting if they have to. They really don't want to. I didn't actually mention native bees don't really sting at all. They have nothing to protect. The only ones that would be the bumblebees, because they do have the bumblebee has a little nest, but she will only sting you if you step on her or if you handle her really rough.
What's an oppressed hair?
Breast hair.
Oppressed hair.
Right.
Here's what
The guys are going.
yeah.
Like gelled.
Yeah, that's it.
Nice. There's the Latin working for us today. That's a really good resource. I just want to let you know about border-free bees. It's a really great, very simple. It gives you the size of the insect you're looking at, and you can kind of get a sense of like the different groupings. Yeah, so that's a really great resource. Okay, so that brings us to sort of like the bulk or the key point of this talk, which is, okay, so having learned a little bit about our bees, well, what can we do for them? How can we better support them? And of course, this talk has been prepared for, you know, the BC Society of Landscape Architects, the BC Landscape and Nursery Association, the Master Gardeners, all kinds of people that work with plants. And so, not to assume, but I'm guessing people here, you probably have a garden, you might have potted plants on your deck. Anyone who makes any choices about the plants in the landscape around them have something to say about bees. Uniquely positioned even to determine the fate of bees. So I'm going to go through some key principles for bee-friendly plantings. And we'll just go through forage, which means food, nesting, and maintenance considerations. So, like all forms of life, bees need forage that is nutritious, non-toxic, and readily available throughout the season. So, of course, that means organic by default, and plantings that have accessible pollen and nectar. You might know some cultivated plants have been so cultivated they don't actually have nectar or pollen anymore. They're just really nice to look at for us. But in terms of real estate and habitat value, 0. They're just taking up space. Yeah, so plant diversity also means the placement of the species and the diversity that we choose. So I'm going to show you, this is like a spreadsheet for a pollinator garden. This is in East Vancouver by the Renfrew Ravine. My friend Marika did this. She was working for the Environmental Youth Alliance. They have a big bee and meadow program. So all you need to know is that these columns are months: February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, and these are the plants. And so because their focus is pollinators, they want to make sure that they're providing forage from as early in the season until at least October. Some of these are still flowering in November. So that's the sort of thinking that you that you really want to ensure that access to healthy forage throughout the bloom period. And otherwise, we came up with 2 basic rules of thumb for plantings. So one is, again, from the growing season, which is early spring until late fall, ensure at least 3 different flowers of variable colors, sizes, and shapes. And of course, that's because bees come in all different sizes and shapes too. Some have long tongues, some have short tongues. So the more inclusive provisions, the better. And then the other rule of thumb is just to fit in native species where you can. And that's because we have many specialist bees that rely specifically on one plant, one species, or one genus. And if that plant is not a landscape, those bees don't exist anymore. So any other plants are just useless real estate. This is a really cool resource. Jared Fowler, he's just south of the Medicine Line. I think in Washington State, he's done a lot of work on pollen specialists. And actually, speaking of pollen specialists, we just produced a new forage guide for both coastal and interior BC. I've actually got a copy here. If anyone wants to look at it. And basically, so for the coast and interior, we've put together a species list of plants that are really good to either protect or grow, because some native plants just aren't grown. There's a lot of native plants that just are not commercially grown. So the best thing you can do is, like, if you see gumweed and you see that there's a development sign there, maybe just kind of go there and find out who the development company is and see if they could maybe hold off on, you know, taking out, or obviously we know stinging nettle is amazing for many species of butterfly. So for specialists require one plant. I'll get more to this later.
We do have gumweed in our nursery though.
Excellent. Don't nursery people. Other plant ideas, pollinator partnership, P2, they do really excellent work. So on their website, you can find lots of resources, including this plant guide, depending on where you live, like literally region by region. So still on the topic of forage, of course, water is life, and bees need water too. They need it for drinking, they need it for air conditioning. If they've got baby bees, like bumblebees, they actually need water to feed their babies. But of course, bees can't swim, so make sure that there's provisions in your, if it's a bird bath or a habitat dish, make sure that they can crawl out and dry out. I was amazed. This was the first habitat pond I ever built, and it was covered in bees. And you can see, look at their tongue is out, like they were just like bathing and swimming and, well, not swimming, but it really surprised me. I was like, oh, I was going for hedgehogs, but we got bees, so that's fine too, I guess. So back to forage, safe, non-toxic, right? So we know that pesticide contamination is widespread. Welcome to one of the problems of industrial society. So what can we do? Well, obviously, we can be aware of how our landscape is contaminated. I really like this drawing from Xerxes, which just shows all the ways that bees are just kind of bombarded with toxic chemicals. So, either it's sprayed right on the plants, in which case, if the bee's on the plant, they might get a direct hit, or they'll get that residual contact just from arriving soon after. Then, of course, the pollen and the nectar is contaminated, so they actually ingest it and die a horrible death of being poisoned. And then, of course, there's a lot of spray that goes right on the ground. So look at this poor bee coming out of their burrow, getting a face full of pesticides. And of course, that's then going to get brought into the burrow. So the nesting material all gets covered in really horrible chemicals. So one thing we can do as people, of course, is check if the plants that we do buy for our landscapes are free from systemic insecticides, which of course is very difficult because a lot of growers don't actually, or like a lot of, not growers, but nursery operators, what's the word I'm looking for? Retailers, they don't actually know whether these plants are, infused with insecticides. So supporting a native plant nursery, like, here, or that's a good way to go.
How long does it take a perennial species to become free of pesticide if you buy one in a nursery? And you don't know whether it is or not, but then they keep growing for several years. How long does it take for the pesticide to kind of disappear?
It's a good question. I have no idea. I do not have a degree in biochemistry, and I honestly don't understand how that works even. Yeah. We should really just shut it down, actually, is what we should do. Yeah, and so we, as a society, we agreed, like, we should ban cosmetic pesticides. If every citizen said enough of this, can we just kind of just drop it? So yeah, responding to that sort of like, I don't know the answer to that. And that's crazy to not know the answer to that, right? It's crazy. Another question?
What's the difference between a cosmetic and a non-cosmetic pesticide?
Right. Well, I guess cosmetic is going to be like, you know, to keep things looking nice. Whereas agricultural, industrial pesticides are probably a larger scale, you know, like if it's food production, then that's definitely not necessarily cosmetic, but I don't know.
Serious, so.
Yeah, huge implications. Yeah. Let's leave it at that for now. Let's move on to the second principle, which is nesting. So bee-friendly design principles will consider the life cycles of these bees. So solitary bees that we see flying around right now on the wing, they generally live for about a year, but in their adult stage, it's like 3 to 6 weeks. So like many insects, they spend most of their time, you know, as a little egg, larva, you know, chrysalis, and as an adult, like a couple weeks. So bee-friendly design is going to honor that, right? That's why the timing of the bloom period is so important. So what can we do to support nesting then? Because when they're flying around, they are nesting. Like their reason of being is to continue their population. So lay eggs, provision them with the resources they need. So provide space and materials for nesting. I mentioned the patchy lawn before. Actually, messy yards and imperfect lawns are great for bees. And just to kind of give you a sense of like, these are some what some nests might look like. So I don't know, has anyone ever experienced like a bumblebee nest kind of showing up like on your deck or in your wall? They will use bird boxes, they will use old rodent burrows, they'll pretty much use whatever they can find. And then of course, the cavity nesters, they will use lots of different materials, anything woody, ideally hollow and pithy stems. But then of course, they also need things like mud to pack, to make their little walls, to separate the cells. Some leaf cutter bees actually cut leaf and or flower petals and we'll kind of get it in there too. And so they need the right kind of materials and resin as well. Resin from conifers to kind of create the paste. And then for ground nesters, again, 70% of our native bees are ground nesters. So bad lawns are great, bare ground, anything that's sandy. So again, like if you spot habitat like that, kind of like if you see a really valuable patch of native plants that's at risk of development, consider patchy lawn the same way. Like maybe it's not that urgent to replace it with nice monotonous turf. Not that anyone here would do that, I guess. But just, you know, your neighbor or whatever. Okay, and now we get to the last principle, which is maintenance. So similar to nesting before, like ideally maintenance is going to be conducted in ways that do not harm bee populations. And actually, can you see this picture? So this is actually a picture my friend Sarah took. She is a PhD researcher on bumblebees. That's a queen bumblebee, and that's the lid of one of her little nectar pots that she has provisioned for her offspring. And she managed to get the shot like into the little burrow. So for above ground maintenance, you know, you want to clean back shrubbery or whatever, think about cavity nesters above ground needs. So if we think about nesting opportunities, well, plants with hollow stems are really great to put onto our landscapes because then they can actually serve as nesting habitat. So some plants with hollow stems that are really good are like anything in the sunflower family, anything in the rose family, the raspberry / blackberry family. Also, elderberry is really good. Snowberry is excellent. Sedum tulipium, autumn joy. It's great. So there's some plants that actually are, actively, possibly going to be providing really good nesting habitat for cavity nesters. But then it does come to maintenance, right? So in the fall, you probably feel inclined to cut things back. So there's a couple things that you can take into consideration. So one is, rather than cutting your dead stems all the way down to the ground, you can actually keep 6 inches to a foot above the ground. So if there are bees that have laid their eggs and built their nests, at least those will be allowed to come to full fruition with the baby bees. Yeah, and this is the mind bender that I still haven't quite mastered, but what you leave will actually become next season's real estate for cavity nesters. And yeah, this is the thing, because adult bees will only emerge in spring or summer the following year. So like when we're planning our garden maintenance, we're actually like, our perspective time-wise is really limited compared to what bees' needs actually are. So these kind of practicalities can be designed in. It's like garden design. So one way that one could approach, like if you've got a big garden and, you know, it's nice to have a nice garden that's not all looking rather wild. So you could, for example, divide the maintenance into thirds. So say the maintenance work is like mowing or raking or even burning. You could, for example, work in 1/3 of the area each year and leave the other 2/3 for nesting insects and just kind of rotate around that way. So that's a nice principle that you can apply. This is a pollinator hedge. So how we can support native bees better in BC. If there's one message I could send home with you today, it would be that bee diversity and plant diversity are one and the same. So the best way actually to protect native pollinators is to protect the habitat and the wild populations of plants that they depend on. So they go hand in hand. Yes, lavender is great for the generalists. A lot of things are great for generalists, but it's the specialists that we need to really be thinking about. So protect patches of native plants used by specialist bees. I mentioned the gumweed. Just to give you a flavor, so we have an interior species of gumweed and the coastal species. The interior species, Grindelia scorosa, supports about 16 species of specialist bees. That's 16 species that if that plant was like removed from the landscape, those bees would also disappear from the landscape. On the coast, we have 4 specialist bees that Grindelia integrifolia supports. And this is the variable carter bee here, Dianthidium subparvum. They actually create a nest of pebbles, which is cemented together with sticky resin. That's where the resin comes in. And actually native trees are amazing for bees. I mean, many trees, right? Just, it's like a wildflower in the sky, wildflower meadow. There's so many flowers on the tree, so many. And actually willows are like, they're like the biggest and best habitat tree for native bees. Native willows support numerous specialists. So 7 on the coast, 14 in the interior. But either way, like any early flowering tree or shrub, willows are like a lifeline for early spring pollinators. In this case, they support both specialists and generalists. So very inclusive in that way. And, you know, kind of getting back to the human habitat, gardens, parks, green spaces, they can reduce fragmentation. And that's maybe the better way to be looking at it. Like my little garden is not going to be able to solve the habitat crisis. However, if I'm planting strategic plants that I know are elsewhere in the landscape, then my little garden can be an island that that supports reduction of fragmentation. And of course, use natives when necessary, when possible. This is one of our specialist bees in the interior. And of course, the shiny patches of soil. If you see ground nesting birds coming out of a crappy piece of ground, I encourage us all to get a little bit closer and really allow that fascination to light the fire inside, and then those bees will be better protected. Because that's actually what it takes, right? It's love. So this is, I put this slide because the bee is so cute. It's a Calides species, and this genus is nicknamed polyester or cellophane bees, and that's because they line the cells of their underground nests with a cellophane-like secretion. Super cute. Yeah, so if you are interested in learning more about native bees in BC, we are a membership-based society, and it's very fun. You can learn a lot. That's why I'm part of it. Constant learning. Yeah, and we're also open to like requests and ideas and collaborative projects. So if anything comes up for you that's, you know, that you're not seeing happening, like we would love to hear from you and make it happen. So that's it for me. And then my final slide has some resources and links that I'll include next. Yeah.